The wind in that part of the Arizona Territory was a thief. It stole the moisture from the earth, leaving behind a puzzle of cracks in the hardened dirt. It stole the seeds Clara Bennett scattered, whipping them away into the canyons before they could take root. It stole the warmth from her bones in the winter and the breath from her lungs in the summer. Most of all, it stole hope, carrying it off like so much dust, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any sound. The Bennett farm was less a farm and more a testament to stubbornness. It clung to the edge of a wide, sun-scorched valley where rock and sand were the primary crops. The small wooden house, built by her father's own hands, had surrendered its paint to the sun years ago, its boards gone the color of bone. The fences sagged, their posts leaning like tired old men, the wire between them humming a mournful tune when the wind blew just right. The corn stalks in the small plot were brown and brittle, their heads bowed in defeat. The well, their lifeline, was growing stingy, each bucket of water hauled up seeming thinner and more precious than the last. Every morning, Clara rose before the sun had summoned the courage to crest the eastern mountains. She would pull on her faded calico dress, tie back her hair, and step out into the cool, gray air. The work was a rhythm she knew better than prayer. She fed the chickens, their clucking a small, lively sound in the vast emptiness. She milked their lone, bony cow, its hide stretched tight over its ribs. Then she would join her father in the fields, or what passed for them. Jacob Bennett was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as their farm. He was tall and spare, his back stooped from years of labor and the weight of a war that had ended on the maps, but not in his mind. A widower for 10 years, he had raised Clara with a rigid sense of duty and a pride that was as unyielding as the desert rock. He had been a soldier, and he saw the world in terms of battles won and lost, of debts owed and paid. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, each one carrying weight and consequence. He never complained about the drought that was strangling them, or the fact that their credit at the general store in town had been stretched thinner than a spider's thread. He simply worked, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on a horizon that offered no promises. Clara worked beside him, her hands calloused, her face browned by the sun. She had her mother's eyes, a deep and thoughtful blue, but her father's resolve. She felt the despair of their situation like a constant, low-grade fever, but she refused to surrender to it. She would mend the fences the wind tried to tear down. She would carry water to the thirstiest of the cornstalks, and she would patch her father's shirts until the patches had patches. She was 19, an age when other girls in more forgiving places might be thinking of dances and ribbons. Clara thought only of survival. The threats were not just in the sky or the soil. They were whispered on the wind, carried from the saloons and boarding houses in the town 20 miles east. Desperate men were drifting through the territory, men who had deserted their army posts, men who had lost their ranches to debt, men whose only skill was with a gun and whose only god was in a bottle. They roamed the backlands, forming ragged gangs that preyed on the isolated and the weak. The Bennetts had heard stories. The Miller Ranch, 60 miles north, had lost half their cattle. A prospector was found dead in a dry creek bed, his pockets turned inside out. These whispers hung in the air, another layer of fear on top of the constant worry about rain and money. Jacob had taken to sleeping with his old army rifle by his bed, a silent admission of a danger he would never voice aloud. One afternoon, as the sun beat down with a white-hot intensity, Clara discovered their mule. Judas was gone. The rope had been gnawed through, and the gate to his small pen was swinging open. Jacob's face hardened. "Stolen," he said, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. A mule was more than an animal. It was their transportation, their plow horse, their partner in the relentless work. Losing him was like losing a limb. Jacob spent the rest of the day tracking the hoof prints, his shoulders set with a grim anger, but the trail vanished in the rocky ground of the canyon that bordered their property to the west. Clara felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. This was it. The whispers had found their way to the Bennett farm. She expected her father to ride into town, to gather a posse, to demand justice. Instead, he returned at dusk, his face a mask of weary defeat, and said nothing more on the matter. The loss was simply another burden to be shouldered in silence. The next morning, as Clara was scattering feed for the chickens, she saw a figure emerge from the mouth of the canyon. She froze, her hand tightening on the feed sack. It was not a white man. He was tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that seemed a part of the landscape itself. He wore buckskin trousers and no shirt, his skin the color of the rich, red earth. His black hair was long, held back from his face by a simple leather band. He was leading Judas by a rope. He stopped at the edge of their property, just beyond the broken fence line. He did not call out. He simply stood there, waiting, his presence as quiet and solid as one of the ancient stones that littered the valley. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had heard the talk in town, the ugly words used to describe the Apache who still lived in the canyons and mountains, refusing to be confined to the reservations. She called for her father, her voice tight and thin. Jacob came out of the house, holding his rifle loosely at his side. He stopped on the porch, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The Apache man, Nantan, met his gaze without expression. He gave a slight tug on the rope, and Judas trotted forward a few steps, stopping to nibble at a patch of stubborn weeds. Nantan lifted a hand, not in greeting, but to point. He pointed first at the gnawed rope still tied to the mule's halter, then back towards the canyon. The meaning was clear. The mule had not been stolen. He had wandered. After a long, silent moment, Nantan let the rope drop to the ground. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod towards Jacob. Then, without another gesture, he turned and walked back the way he had come, his bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He disappeared into the shadows of the canyon as if he had been a dream. Jacob stood motionless for a full minute, his rifle still in his hand. He finally lowered it, a flicker of something unreadable, surprise, perhaps even respect, in his eyes. He walked out, took Judas by the halter, and led him back to the pen without a word. The encounter was not spoken of again, but it settled in Clara's mind, a strange and unsettling stone in the quiet pool of her days. He had a name. She knew. Nantan. She had heard it spoken once in town, spat out like a curse. The heat of the summer deepened, and with it, the tension in the territory. The rumors in town grew louder, uglier. Talk of Indians near the farms, of chickens disappearing from henhouses and tools vanishing from barns. Fear soured the tempers of the settlers, turning suspicion into outright hatred. Men who had come west for a new life now saw enemies in every shadow, particularly if that shadow was cast by a man with dark skin. Clara heard the talk when she went to the store for flour and salt. She saw the way the women pulled their children closer, the way the men gathered in tight, angry knots, their voices low and venomous. She did not mention the quiet man who had returned their mule. She knew what they would say, and she felt a strange, protective instinct to keep his act of simple decency to herself. The breaking point came on a moonless night, so dark it felt as if the world was wrapped in black velvet. Clara was jolted from a light and uneasy sleep by a sound that cut through the chirping of the crickets, gunshots, sharp and angry, followed by the drunken whoops of men. She sat bolt upright in her small bed, her skin cold with dread. A hellish, orange glow flickered against her window. "Father!" she cried, scrambling from the bed and running into the main room. Jacob was already there, pulling on his boots, his face grim in the dancing firelight. "Stay inside! Clara, bar the door behind me!" She ran to the window and peered out. The glow was coming from their nearest neighbor's property, the Henderson place, a mile down the valley. Flames were leaping from the roof of their barn, devouring the dry wood with a terrible hunger. Figures on horseback, silhouetted against the inferno. circled the blaze like demons, firing their guns into the air. Raiders. Her father grabbed his rifle and was out the door before she could protest. She did as he said, sliding the heavy wooden bar across the door, her hands trembling. She could hear the raiders' shouts more clearly now, carried on the night air. There were 4 of them. They were laughing. After a few more minutes of terrorizing the Hendersons, they seemed to tire of their game. 2 of them turned their horses and began riding directly towards the Bennett farm. Panic seized Clara, cold and sharp. Her father was out there somewhere in the darkness. 1 man against 2, maybe more. The house suddenly felt like a trap, its thin wooden walls offering no real protection. She could hear the thunder of hooves growing closer, the crunch of the dry earth beneath their weight. A bottle smashed against the side of the house, followed by a roar of laughter.
"Come on out, old man,"
a slurred voice shouted.
"We hear you got a pretty daughter in there."
Clara backed away from the door, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around desperately for a weapon, for a place to hide. There was nowhere. This was how it ended. All their work, all their stubborn pride, consumed in a blaze of senseless violence. A shot rang out, closer this time, from the direction of their own small barn. One of the riders grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and then there was the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. The second rider reined his horse in sharply, whirling around, his pistol raised. "Who's there?" he yelled into the darkness. There was no answer but the wind. Then a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows near the water trough. It moved with a terrifying speed and silence. It was Nantan. He held a long knife in one hand, its blade catching a faint glimmer of the distant fire. The rider fired his pistol wildly, the bullet whining past Nantan's head. Before the man could fire again, Nantan was on him. He leaped, grabbing the man's gun arm and pulling him from the saddle. They fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs. There was a brief, brutal struggle, a choked cry, the sickening sound of a blow landing, and then stillness. The rider lay unmoving. The other 2 raiders, seeing what had happened, let out a string of curses. One of them, the man who had been moaning on the ground, tried to rise, clutching a bloody leg. The 4th man hesitated for only a second before kicking his horse into a gallop, fleeing back into the night without a backward glance. Nantan rose slowly from the ground. He stood over the still form of the second rider for a moment before turning his attention to the one on the ground with the wounded leg. The man whimpered, trying to crawl away. Nantan walked over to him, his movements deliberate, devoid of any anger or haste. He looked down at the man, his face an unreadable mask in the dim light. He did not kill him. He simply stood there, a silent, menacing sentinel, until the man's whimpering subsided into terrified silence. Just then, Jacob emerged from the shadows near the house, his rifle held ready. He had been there the whole time, a silent witness. He and Nantan looked at each other across the dusty yard, over the bodies of the men who had come to destroy them. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and spilled whiskey. The only sounds were the crackling of the distant fire and the ragged breathing of the wounded man. Clara, who had watched the entire scene through the window with a horrified fascination, finally found the strength to move. She unbarred the door and ran out onto the porch, her gaze darting from her father to the Apache warrior, to the men lying in the dirt. Her world had tilted on its axis. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had been taught to fear, was now tangled and confused. The man they called a savage had just saved them. They stood there as the black of night slowly gave way to the bruised purple of dawn. The fire at the Hendersons had died down to a smoldering ruin. The wounded raider had passed out from pain or fear. The other 2 were still and silent. It was over. As the first rays of the sun spilled over the mountains, painting the valley in pale shades of gold and rose, Jacob Bennett finally lowered his rifle. He walked slowly across the yard until he was standing directly in front of Nantan. He was a tall man, but the Apache seemed to match his height. his posture straight and proud. They stood eye to eye, the old soldier and the native warrior, two men forged by the harshness of the same land. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of what had happened, of the debt that had been incurred. Clara watched, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. She did not know what to expect. A handshake? An offer of money? Her father was a man of principle, a man who always paid his debts. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, yet it carried across the yard with absolute clarity. He did not look at the dead man, or the wounded one. He looked only at Nantan. "You protected my farm," he said, his words measured and final. He paused, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second to where Clara stood on the porch. Then he looked back at Nantan. "My daughter is unmarried. You saved her." Another pause, this one heavier than all the silence that had come before it. "You'll take her." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. A wave of ice and fire washed over her. She felt the blood drain from her face, and the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. It was not a proposal. It was a decree, a payment. She was being offered up like a head of cattle, a piece of property to settle a debt of honor. A hot, suffocating shame rose in her throat, choking her. She wanted to scream, to cry out that he had no right, that she was not his to give away. But the words would not come. She stood frozen, rooted to the spot, her world narrowing to the space between the two men. She looked from her father's rigid, determined face to the Apache's. His expression had not changed. His eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on her father, but she felt their pull, their unreadable intensity. In their depths, she saw no triumph, no desire, no satisfaction. She saw nothing she could name, only a stillness that was as vast and as ancient as the desert itself. And though she was horrified, though she was shamed to her very core, she found she could not look away. The sun rose on a day that felt like a funeral. The air was still and heavy, carrying the stench of scorched wood from the Hendersons' barn and the metallic tang of dried blood in the dust. The body of the raider Nantan had killed had been dragged away, as had the one he'd incapacitated. Jacob had dealt with the wounded man, tying him to his horse and sending him off with a grim warning to the town marshal. Now, an unnatural quiet had fallen over the farm, a quiet that was louder and more oppressive than the chaos of the night before. Clara had not slept. She had sat in the dark of her room, watching the stars fade, her father's words echoing in her mind. "You'll take her." Each word was a nail in the coffin of the life she knew. She felt a cold, hard knot of fury in her stomach, a rage so profound it left no room for tears. She was not a sack of grain to be traded, not a piece of land to be bartered. She was his daughter. When she finally emerged from her room, her father was sitting at the rough-hewn kitchen table, cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and precise. He did not look up as she entered. "You cannot be serious," Clara said, her voice low and trembling with a rage she fought to control. Jacob continued his work, rubbing an oiled cloth along the barrel. "I have never been more serious in my life." "You would sell me? To him? To a stranger? An Indian?" The words tasted like poison in her mouth, the very words she had heard spat with venom in town. He finally stopped and looked at her, his eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and distant. "I am not selling you, Clara. I am honoring a debt. That man," he said, gesturing with his head toward the world outside the window, "stood between this house and ruin. He stood between you and a fate worse than death. What do I have to offer him in payment? This land, it is half dead and mortgaged to the hilt. Money, we have none. A man of honor pays his debts with the best he has. The future of this house, its life, is all that is of value here. That is you." Tears of frustration and shame finally sprang to her eyes. "Honor? You call this honor? To hand your daughter over like livestock? This is madness. Father, it is barbaric." "This land has rules," he said, his voice flat, cutting through her pleas. Older rules than the ones they write in their books in the East. Some debts are not paid with gold. He saved the heart of this farm. He is owed it. "I will not do it," she whispered, her defiance a fragile thing against the iron of his will. "I will run away first." "And go where?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "To be a seamstress in town, earning pennies until your fingers bleed, to serve drinks to drunks in a saloon. There is no world out there for a woman alone. You know that. Here, you have a home. He protected it. Now it is his responsibility, and you are part of it." He picked up the rifle again. The conversation, in his mind, concluded. Clara stood there, shaking, her fists clenched at her sides. She felt trapped, caged by her father's rigid code, by the unforgiving land, by the silent man who was the cause of it all. She turned and fled the house, running until her lungs burned, not stopping until she reached the small, withered tree that marked her mother's grave. She sank to the ground, the hot, dry earth beneath her, and finally let the sobs come. Great racking sobs of despair and fury that shook her entire body. But the desert simply swallowed her grief, offering no comfort, no echo, only a vast, indifferent silence. Nantan did not press the matter. He neither accepted nor refused Jacob's decree. He simply gathered the few belongings he had, a blanket, a water skin, the long knife, and moved from the canyon's mouth to the thin ribbon of a river that marked the western edge of the Bennett property. He made a small, unobtrusive camp under a cluster of cottonwood trees, the only green for miles. He built a fire that gave off almost no smoke. He was a ghost on the edge of their lives, a silent, watchful presence that was a constant reminder of Clara's fate. Days passed in a state of suspended misery. Jacob acted as if everything was settled. He instructed Clara to take food to Nantan each evening. "He is a guest, for now," was all he said. The first time, Clara cooked the salt pork and beans with a simmering rage, her movements sharp and angry. She marched down to the river, the tin plate hot in her hands. Nantan was sitting by his fire, sharpening the blade of his knife on a smooth stone. He looked up as she approached, his face impassive. She did not know what to say, what to do. The injustice of it all bubbled up inside her, hot and bitter. With a choked cry of fury, she threw the plate at his feet. The food spilled into the dust. "There," she spat. Take it all." Nantan did not flinch. He did not move. He simply watched her, his dark eyes holding hers until she could bear it no longer, humiliated by her own outburst. She turned and ran back to the house. The next evening, Jacob ordered her to go again. She refused, but his cold, commanding stare defeated her. Trembling with resentment, she took the plate of food and walked back to the river, prepared for another silent, hateful confrontation. When she reached his camp, he was not there, but sitting on the flat rock where he had been the night before was the tin plate and fork from the previous night. They were perfectly clean, washed in the river and dried in the sun. Clara stared at the clean plate. It was such a small thing, yet it disarmed her completely. He could have been angry. He could have shouted at her, refused any more food, or simply ignored her. Instead, he had responded to her childish rage with a quiet, dignified gesture. He had returned her dish, washed. It was a gesture of respect, a gesture that suggested an order to things she did not understand. She left the new plate of food on the rock and walked back to the house, a seed of confusion planted in the barren ground of her anger. Her shame, which had been a hot, burning thing directed at her father and her fate, slowly began to turn inward. It evolved into a reluctant curiosity, and then into a creeping sense of guilt. She had thrown food at the feet of a man who had saved her life. She had screamed at him when he had asked for nothing, demanded nothing. She began to watch him from a distance. She saw the way he moved, with an economy of motion, a deep and abiding stillness. She saw him hunt, not with a rifle, but with a simple bow, taking only a single rabbit and leaving no trace of his passage. She started to see the world through his eyes, or at least to imagine it. She saw a man who the world called a savage, a man who was hated and feared simply for the blood that ran in his veins. And yet, that man had risked his own life to defend a white farmer and his daughter from men of their own kind. He had fought with a brutal efficiency. Yes, but he had done so in their defense. He had shown more honor in one night of violence than the sneering men in town had shown in their entire lives. The realization settled on her with a heavy weight. The injustice was not what was happening to her. The true injustice was the world that had created this situation. She stopped throwing the food. She would walk to his camp, set the plate down on the rock, and retreat. He was often there, watching her, but he never spoke. The silence between them was a living thing, filled with unspoken questions. One evening, she found the courage to break it. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him, but at the river flowing nearby. "For the other night?" He said nothing for a long time. She was about to turn and leave when his voice came, low and rough, as if unused. "The debt is your father's." It was not the answer she expected. He was not claiming a reward. He was acknowledging her father's rigid code, but not necessarily agreeing to it. The next day, she asked another question. "Where is your family?" He was mending a tear in his blanket, his fingers surprisingly nimble. He did not look up. "Gone." The single word held a universe of loss. She did not press him, but she kept asking her quiet questions. A few days apart, feeling her way across the vast, silent space between them. She asked about his tribe, and he told her the name of his people, the Chiricahua Apache. She asked him what Nantan meant, and he said, simply, "Chief." He offered her small pieces of his life, like stones she could hold in her hand. But he never gave her the whole story. He never explained. The summer heat finally broke one afternoon in a spectacular display of violence. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue for weeks, turned the color of a deep bruise. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, shot through with veins of lightning. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, tearing at the roof of the small house. A storm was coming. Clara had an irrational urge to talk to him, to be near his strange, calming stillness as the world outside raged. She took a shawl and ran down to his camp. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tore at her dress. He was standing by the river, watching the approaching storm, as if in conversation with it. She stood beside him, and for a long time, they both just watched the sky. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up puffs of dust around them. "Why?" she asked, her voice raised to be heard over the wind. "Why did you do it? Why did you help us? You could have let them burn the farm. You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond that deep, unreadable stillness. It was a flicker of an old pain, a profound sadness. The wind howled, and the rain began to fall in earnest, plastering her hair to her face, soaking her thin dress. He looked at her, at the rain running down her cheeks like tears, and his answer, when it came, was so quiet, so simple, it almost stole the breath from her lungs. "Because you were crying." He said it as a statement of fact, with no sentimentality, but the words struck her with more force than the wind. He had not intervened because of honor, or duty, or the prospect of reward. He had done it because he had heard her fear that first night, hidden in the house, and it had moved him to act. It was a purely human reason. In that moment, standing in the heart of the storm, she saw him not as an Apache, not as a warrior, not as her decreed husband, but simply as a man who had seen another's suffering and could not turn away. The last of her anger washed away with the rain. The wedding was set for the following week. Her father, seeing some change in her demeanor, took her quiet resignation as acceptance. He rode into town and made the arrangements with Reverend Thompson, a man whose piety was matched only by his fear of anything that existed outside the pages of his Bible. The day of the wedding was gray and overcast, the storm having given way to a low, oppressive sky. There were no guests. There were no flowers. There was only the grim finality of the event. Reverend Thompson arrived on his tired horse, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon against the devil. He refused to step inside the house if Nantan was in it, so the ceremony was held in the yard, under the same sky that had witnessed the violence and the offer. Clara wore her Sunday dress, a plain blue cotton garment, faded from countless washings. She had braided her hair carefully, her fingers moving automatically, her mind a numb and empty space. Nantan stood beside her, wearing the same buckskin trousers, but he had put on a clean, simple cloth shirt. He stood tall and straight, his presence a stark and powerful contrast to the fidgeting, nervous preacher. Reverend Thompson rushed through the words, his voice thin and reedy, stumbling over the passages as if they were distasteful in his mouth. He barely looked at Nantan, directing all his words to Jacob and to Clara. When it came time for the vows, Clara's voice was a broken whisper. Her hand, when Nantan took it, was as cold as ice. His was warm and steady. She could feel the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. She did not look at him. She stared at a loose thread on the preacher's black coat, focusing on it as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a stunned silence fell over the small group. The words seemed absurd, impossible. "You may," the preacher began, then trailed off, looking from Clara's pale face to Nantan's impassive one. He cleared his throat. "The union is sealed in the eyes of God and the law of the territory." He had them sign a piece of paper, Jacob signing as a witness. Nantan made a simple, elegant mark, a symbol she did not recognize. The preacher took the offered payment, a scrawny chicken, and practically fled, eager to put the unnatural union behind him. That night, the silence in the small house was a palpable thing. It pressed in on Clara from all sides, suffocating her. Her father retreated to his room immediately after the meager supper, closing the door behind him, leaving them alone, man and wife. Clara's hands trembled as she cleared the table. She could feel Nantan's eyes on her, but she could not bring herself to look at him, to speak to him. The house had only 2 rooms, her father's, and the main room where her own small bed was in one corner. There was nowhere to go. After she had washed and dried the last dish, she stood by the cold hearth, her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself. She waited, her body rigid with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She heard him rise from the table. She heard his soft, bare footsteps on the wooden floor. He did not approach her. He walked to the door, took his blanket from the peg where he had hung it, and stepped outside into the night. He did not say a word. Clara finally turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crept to the window and peered out through a crack in the curtains. He had not gone back to his camp by the river. He had spread his blanket on the ground near the porch, a silent guardian for the house he now belonged to, and the woman who was now his wife. He lay down and pulled the blanket over him, his face turned towards the stars. She watched him for a long time, a storm of emotions raging inside her. There was revulsion, a deep, primal fear of the strangeness of her situation. There was an immense, overwhelming wave of gratitude for his decency, for his quiet understanding of her fear. And underneath it all, there was something else, a small, fragile seedling of a feeling she could not yet give a name to. It was a sense of shared loneliness, of being 2 people set apart from the world, bound together not by love or choice, but by a single, desperate act under a dark and starless sky. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that nothing in her life would ever be the same. The days that followed the wedding were a study in silence. A new routine settled over the farm, quiet and strange. Each night, Nantan slept outside on his blanket, a steadfast guardian at the edge of the porch. Each morning, he would be gone before the sun was fully risen, and he would return at dusk for the meal Clara left for him on the kitchen table. He was a part of their lives. Yet, apart from them, he was her husband. Yet he was a stranger. Clara, no longer consumed by rage, found herself watching him. In the vacuum of her old anger, a quiet, intense curiosity took root. She began to observe him not as the savage of town gossip, nor as the symbol of her father's rigid honor, but as a man living in a world whose rules she was just beginning to perceive. She noticed the small, significant ways he had begun to inhabit the space of the farm. One afternoon, she saw him by the sagging fence line at the north pasture. He was not using a hammer or new nails. He had found a length of discarded wire and was lashing a fallen post back into place, his movements economical and precise. He tested it with his weight, his brow furrowed in concentration, and when it held firm, he gave a single, satisfied nod and moved on to the next weak spot. He had not been asked. He had simply seen a thing that was broken and had set about mending it. Another time, she saw him returning from a hunt, a lean jackrabbit slung over his shoulder. After skinning and cleaning the animal with a surgeon's care, he took the leftover bones and entrails and placed them deliberately near the base of a large, gnarled mesquite tree, 100 yards from the chicken coop. She had meant to ask him why, but the answer came that night in the form of a coyote's distant howl, a sound that was answered by another, farther away from the house than she had heard in months. He was not just living on the land. He was in a constant, silent dialogue with it, creating boundaries, offering tributes, understanding its hidden language. She watched the way he walked. He still wore no shoes, and his bare feet seemed to read the terrain. He moved with a reverence that made her own booted steps feel clumsy and loud. He would walk around a patch of wildflowers instead of through it. He would pause to listen to a bird call, his head cocked as if deciphering a message. He was more a part of the landscape than the house he was now tied to. This quiet competence, this deep, ingrained connection to the earth, was both unsettling and strangely compelling. It was a strength she had never witnessed before, a strength that had nothing to do with rifles or loud words. While Nantan's presence slowly, subtly began to heal the broken parts of the farm, Jacob Bennett began to fade. The iron will that had governed his life, and hers, seemed to be rusting from the inside out. He grew more distant with each passing day, his silence no longer stoic but hollow. He would sit on the porch for hours, staring out at the parched fields, his old army rifle resting across his knees. But his eyes were not seeing the dying corn. They were looking at something far away, something in the past that held him captive. He rarely spoke to Clara, and he never spoke to Nantan at all. He would leave food on the table for the man who was now his son-in-law, a duty fulfilled. But he never looked him in the eye. A bitter, hacking cough took root in his chest. At first, it was just a dry tickle in the mornings, but it soon deepened into a rattling, body-racking spasm that left him breathless and pale. He waved away Clara's concern, dismissing it as a touch of dust, but she saw the way he aged in a matter of weeks. The lines on his face deepened. His broad shoulders began to slump, and a glassy, far-away look settled permanently in his eyes. It was as if, having fulfilled his final, terrible duty of honor, the purpose that had driven him for so long had simply evaporated, leaving an empty vessel behind. The world outside the farm did not share their quiet, internal struggles. Its judgment was loud and vicious. When Clara rode Judas into town for supplies, a journey she now undertook with a knot of dread in her stomach, she felt the change immediately. The whispers started the moment she tied the mule to the hitching post outside the general store. They were like the rustle of snakes in dry grass. Just at the edge of her hearing, inside the store, Mrs. Gable, A woman who had known Clara since she was a child suddenly became very busy counting a stack of tins, her back rigid. The few other women in the store fell silent, their eyes cutting to her, then quickly away, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. She could feel their words, even unspoken. That Bennett girl. At the post office, it was worse. The clerk, a thin man with watery eyes, looked through her as he handed her the mail. A group of men standing by the stove fell quiet as she entered, but as she turned to leave, she heard a man's low voice, thick with malice. "Heard she is laying with an Apache now? Bet her daddy is real proud." A snort of cruel laughter followed. Clara's face burned with shame. She kept her head high, her back straight, and walked out into the harsh sunlight, her heart pounding a painful rhythm against her ribs. The 20-mile ride back to the farm felt like a journey through a foreign country. The whispers had built a wall around her, separating her from the world she had always known. She was an outcast. A week later, the whispers took on a more threatening form. She was on her way home, the sun low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. As she rounded a bend bordered by a thicket of scrub oak, 3 riders blocked her path. They were young ranchers from a spread to the south, their faces flushed with sun and cheap whiskey. She recognized one of them, Jebediah, a lout with a mean streak who had tried to court her once. Clumsily and without success. Well, look what we have here," Jebediah said, a smirk on his face as he nudged his horse closer. "It is the Indian's woman." His 2 companions chuckled, their eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Let me pass, Jebediah," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. She kept her hands firm on Judas's reins.
In a hurry to get back to your savage, he sneered. What is it like, Clara? Does he grunt at you in his heathen tongue? Does he treat you like the squaw you are?
The other men laughed louder this time. Clara's face was pale, but her eyes flashed with anger. "You are drunk! Get out of my way!" "Maybe we want a little taste of what that redskin is getting," one of the others said, his eyes gleaming. He started to dismount. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara's anger. Her heart leaped into her throat. They were miles from any help. The empty landscape offered no sanctuary. Just as the man's boot touched the ground, a sound, or rather a lack of one, made them all freeze. A figure had emerged from the rocks on the side of the trail. It was Nantan. He had seemingly materialized from the earth itself, his presence sudden and absolute. He held his bow in one hand, an arrow resting loosely against the string. He did not raise it. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his body poised, his dark eyes fixed on the 3 men. The air grew thick and heavy. The ranchers, who had been full of loud, drunken bravado moments before, were now utterly still. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by expressions of shock and a dawning fear. Nantan's silence was more menacing than any threat they could have imagined. It was the silence of a predator, the calm before a strike that would be swift and final. He did not look angry. He looked patient. Jebediah swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He stared at Nantan, then at his companions, who were avoiding his gaze. The drunken flush had drained from their faces, leaving them pasty and unnerved. After a long, tense moment that stretched into an eternity, Jebediah yanked on his horse's reins. "Let's go," he muttered, not looking at Clara. "She is not worth the trouble." They kicked their horses into a gallop, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust. Their retreat, as cowardly as their advance, had been arrogant. Clara sat on the mule, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear. She watched as Nantan lowered his bow, the arrow never having been drawn. He walked over to her, his movements as fluid and unhurried as always. He stopped beside the mule and looked up at her, his expression unreadable. That night, after a supper eaten in their usual silence, Clara knew she had to speak. The tension of the unspoken was a wall between them. But for the first time, She wanted to tear it down. She found him outside, standing at the edge of the porch, looking up at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky. "They would have," she began, her voice catching. "I do not know what they would have done." She took a breath, forcing the words out. "Thank you for being there." It was the first time she had thanked him with genuine, unreserved sincerity. It was not for saving the farm. It was for saving her. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze still on the heavens. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, almost a part of the night itself. He turned his head slightly to look at her. "You owe me nothing," he said. The words settled in her heart with a profound weight. With that simple phrase, he had swept away the last vestiges of her father's transaction. He was telling her that she was not a payment for a debt. Whatever existed between them now, it was new, unwritten, belonging only to them. A few days later, the first true moment of tenderness passed between them, as silent and as powerful as his arrival on the trail. She had gone down to the river to fetch water just after dawn. The air was cool and clear, and the light was soft. As she approached the cottonwoods, she saw him. He was standing in the shallow water, his back to her. He was shirtless, and the morning sun illuminated the powerful lines of his back and shoulders. He was washing, and as he turned, she saw a long, ugly gash on his left shoulder, inflamed and angry-looking. It was a fresh wound. Clara stopped, hidden partly by the trees. She did not know where the wound had come from. A fall, an animal, a fight? He winced as he sluiced water over it, his face tight with pain. He had protected her from the ranchers, but who protected him from the world's dangers? An unexpected wave of protectiveness, of deep and aching concern, washed over her. She watched him, forgetting the water bucket, forgetting everything but the sight of him, vulnerable and alone in the morning light. She watched for too long. He must have sensed her presence. He slowly turned his head, his wet hair clinging to his neck, and his eyes met hers across the short distance. He did not seem surprised. He simply looked at her, and she looked back. The air crackled with a sudden, charged intimacy. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. It was a moment stripped bare of everything but the simple fact of their two selves. A man, a woman. She saw the pain in his eyes, and something else, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She felt the blood rise to her cheeks, but she did not look away. Neither of them spoke. After a long, silent moment, he turned back to the river, and she, her hands trembling slightly, finally bent to fill her bucket. The inevitable came on a sweltering morning a week later. Jacob did not come out of his room for breakfast. When Clara went to check on him, she found him collapsed on the floor beside his bed, his body burning with fever, his breathing shallow and ragged. The cough had finally won. She managed to get him back into bed, his body a dead weight. She spent the day nursing him, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, trying to get him to sip some water. He was lost to her, trapped in a fever dream, muttering names of men she did not know. Men from his past, from the war. Nantan appeared at the doorway that evening, a silent shadow. He looked at the sick man in the bed, then at Clara's exhausted face. Without a word, he went outside and returned with an armful of firewood, which he used to build up the fire in the hearth, though the night was warm. Then he disappeared again, melting into the dusk. He returned an hour later, his hands full of roots and leaves she did not recognize. He crushed them with a stone, mixed them with hot water, and offered the steaming, pungent brew to Clara in a cup. "For the fever," he said. She hesitated for only a second, then took it. She trusted his knowledge of the land more than she trusted any town doctor. She managed to get a few spoonfuls of the bitter liquid into her father. For the next 2 days, they kept a vigil. Clara stayed by the bedside, sleeping in fits and starts in a chair. Nantan kept the fire going, brewed the herbal medicine, and hunted for food, which he would cook and leave for her, never intruding on her grief, but always there, a solid, quiet presence in the background. On the third night, the fever seemed to break. Jacob's eyes opened, and for a moment, they were clear. He looked at Clara, a flicker of his old self returning. His hand, thin and frail, reached for hers. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He looked past her, as if seeing something else in the room. "Don't let them take the land." His eyes found hers again, and his grip tightened with a surprising strength. "It is yours and his now." His gaze shifted to the doorway, where Nantan stood watching, and, for the first time, Jacob looked at his son-in-law without a wall between them. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a final acknowledgement, a final transfer of responsibility. Then his eyes closed, and he fell back into the fever's grip. He died just as the sun was rising, the passage from life to death as quiet and as gentle as a sigh. The rattling in his chest simply stopped. Clara sat with him until the sun was high in the sky, her hand holding his, which was now cold and still. The grief was a vast, empty ache inside her, a hollowed-out space where her anger and her love for him had once resided. Nantan made the coffin from the boards of the collapsing shed, his hands sure and steady. Together, they dug the grave on the small rise next to her mother's. They did not speak. There were no prayers, no hymns. The only sounds were the scrape of the shovels against the rocky soil and the sigh of the wind. When it was over, when the last mound of earth was in place, they stood before the two simple wooden crosses. The finality of it was absolute. She was truly alone now, the last of her bloodline in this harsh, unforgiving land. A wave of desolation, so powerful it threatened to pull her under, washed over her. Her body began to tremble, and a single, dry sob escaped her lips. She did not know why she did it. It was an instinct, a desperate need for a single, solid point in a world that had come completely undone. She turned and rested her forehead against Nantan's chest. She did not cry, but she leaned her weight against him, her hands pressed flat against the worn fabric of his shirt. He stood perfectly still. For a moment, she thought he would pull away, that she had crossed a line that should never be crossed. But he did not move. He simply stood there, solid as the ancient rock beneath their feet, and he let her be weak. He let her lean on him. And in his stillness, in his quiet acceptance of her grief, she felt the first fragile seed of a new beginning. After the raw earth had settled over her father's grave, the silence he left behind filled every corner of the small house. It was a hollow, ringing silence, different from the quiet watchfulness that had existed before. For 2 days, Nantan continued to sleep on the porch, a guardian at the gate of her grief. On the third night, as a cold wind swept down from the mountains, Clara left his blanket folded on the floor in the corner of the main room, near the hearth. It was not an invitation. Not yet, but a simple acknowledgement of the cold and of the fact that the house was now as much his as it was hers. When he came in from the dusk, he looked at the blanket, then at her, his eyes asking a question she could not answer. He said nothing, but that night, for the first time, he slept inside, his slow, steady breathing a comforting presence in the vast emptiness. Life settled into a new, awkward rhythm. They were two planets in a small, shared orbit, circling each other with a careful gravity, close but never touching. The walls between them were invisible, yet solid, built of different histories, different worlds, and the strange, violent circumstances of their union. But slowly, stone by silent stone, the walls began to erode. It happened not in words, but in the shared work of survival. The farm was dying. Her father's methods, learned in the greener lands of the East, were no match for the relentless Arizona sun. The corn stalks were yellow and stunted, and the beans withered on the vine. Clara worked herself to exhaustion, hauling buckets of water from the stingy well, her hope dwindling with each drop that evaporated into the thirsty air. One morning, she was kneeling in the dust, looking at a row of dying corn shoots, the despair a physical weight in her chest. Nantan approached, his bare feet making no sound. He knelt beside her, not looking at her, but at the earth. He dug into the cracked soil with his fingers, his touch gentle, as if listening to the land's complaints. He pulled up one of the withered shoots, showing her the shallow, thirsty roots. Then, he showed her. He chose a new spot and dug a hole much deeper than she ever would have. A good foot into the cooler, darker soil below the surface. He dropped a few kernels into the bottom, then placed a small, smooth stone beside them before covering the hole. He gestured to the stone, then pointed to the sky, then back to the stone. It took her a moment to understand. The stone would grow cool in the night and collect the morning dew, feeding it directly to the seeds. It was a small, secret magic of the desert, a way of coaxing life from the barren ground. He worked his way down the row, and she worked beside him, copying his movements. A silent student in a school where the only teacher was the earth itself. In the evenings, as the sun set and the house filled with the soft light of the kerosene lamp, she returned the favor. She pulled out her father's old, cracked leather ledgers, the pages filled with his cramped, spidery handwriting. The farm was drowning in debt, but the numbers and words were a meaningless scrawl to Nantan. Clara, who had been taught to read and write by her mother, found a purpose in the neat columns of figures. "This is a 1, she would say, drawing the number on a piece of slate. "And this is a 5. He would watch, his focus absolute. He learned with a startling quickness, his mind sharp and uncluttered. He would trace the shape of the numbers with his finger, his touch as careful as it had been with the seeds in the earth. She moved from numbers to letters, teaching him the words her father had written: debt, flower, seed, mortgage, interest. They were the hard, unyielding words of their existence. But in teaching them, she felt as if she were giving him a map to her world, just as he had given her the key to his. They were building a bridge of shared knowledge across the silent chasm that separated them. Moments of lightness began to break through the quiet solemnity of their lives, like wildflowers pushing up through the cracked earth. Her mother's old rocking chair, which had sat silent in a corner for 10 years, had a broken rocker. Clara had tried to fix it, but the wood was split and would not hold a nail. Nantan took it outside one afternoon and spent hours carefully shaping a new piece of wood with his knife, sanding it smooth with a piece of sandstone. He fixed it without glue or nails, fitting the pieces together with an ingenious, interlocking joint. When he brought it back inside, he gestured for her to try it. She sat down, and the chair rocked with a smooth, gentle motion, the rhythm of a memory she thought she had lost. A smile, genuine and unforced, touched her lips. She looked up at him, and he was watching her. A faint, almost imperceptible softness in his eyes. A low chuckle escaped her, a sound of pure, simple pleasure. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch in response. That night, in a surge of gratitude, she decided to cook him a proper meal, not just the salt pork and beans that were their staple. She found the last of their shriveled onions and carrots and combined them with a rabbit he had hunted, adding the precious herbs her mother had carefully tended in a small window box. It was her mother's stew, a dish she had not made since the funeral. As they ate at the small table, the rich, savory aroma filled the house with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He ate slowly, deliberately, and when he was finished, he looked at her across the table. "Good," he said. The single word was a profound compliment. "It was my mother's," she heard herself say, her voice soft. "She used to say it could mend anything from a broken heart to a bad winter." He considered this. "A strong stew," he said, his face serious. And then, A tiny, fleeting smile touched his lips. The chair was not so broken. Clara stared at him, stunned. It was a joke, a small, quiet, perfectly formed joke. A laugh burst out of her, loud and clear and full of a relief she had not known she was holding. And across the table, Nantan smiled back, a true, open smile that transformed his face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. In that moment, the house was not a cage or a debt to be paid. It was simply a home, and they were two people sharing a meal within it. The world outside, however, was not so gentle. One night, it came for them with a fury. A dust storm, born in the flatlands to the east, descended on the valley. It began as a low moan of wind, a yellow haze on the horizon. Within an hour, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised brown, and the sun was blotted out. The wind shrieked like a banshee, throwing handfuls of sand and grit against the thin walls of the house. Clara had rushed to shutter the windows, stuffing rags into the cracks, but the fine, choking dust found its way in, coating everything in a brown film. The house groaned under the assault. Suddenly, with a sound like a cannon shot, a section of the roof over the main room tore away. Wind and dust poured in, a vortex of chaos. The lamp blew out, plunging them into a terrifying, roaring darkness. Clara cried out, stumbling back, her hands flying to her face to ward off the stinging grit. She could see nothing. The noise was deafening, the world reduced to a maelstrom of wind and sand. In a surge of pure, primal fear, she reached out into the darkness. "Nantan!" His hand found hers instantly, his grip strong and sure. He did not speak. He pulled her through the storm inside their own home, guiding her to the relative shelter of the corner by the hearth, away from the gaping hole in the roof. He pushed her down to the floor, then covered her body with his own, shielding her from the worst of the debris. She buried her face in his shoulder, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt, her body trembling uncontrollably. He was solid and warm and real in the midst of the chaos, an anchor in the storm. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm of calm in a world gone mad. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind's shriek subsided to a mournful sigh, and a sliver of pale moonlight pierced the hole in the roof, illuminating a room thick with dust and ruin. They remained as they were for a long moment, tangled together on the floor. The dust was settling, the silence profound. Clara slowly lifted her head. Her face was inches from his. She could see the grit in his hair, the weary lines around his eyes, which were fixed on hers with an unnerving intensity. The world had been torn apart and put back together, and in the process, the last wall between them had crumbled into dust. She did not know who moved first. It was as if they were drawn together by a force as powerful and as elemental as the storm itself. Her hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, a gesture of wonder, of discovery. His name was a whisper on her lips. His head lowered to hers, and their first kiss was as hesitant and as trembling as a newborn fawn. It was a kiss of dust and desperation, of fear and a gratitude so profound it felt like an ache in her soul. It was the taste of survival. Tears she had not known she was holding slipped from her eyes and traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was crying for her father, for her lost life, for the terrifying, beautiful strangeness of the man holding her. He felt her tears and pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers in the dim moonlight. Then, with a tenderness that shattered her, he kissed her again, softly this time, a kiss that was not about the storm, but about the quiet after. It was a kiss of comfort, of promise. It asked for nothing and offered everything. The next morning, she awoke in her own bed, the early light filtering through the dusty windows. She was not alone. Nantan lay beside her, his breathing deep and even in sleep. Sometime in the night, he had carried her there. They had not spoken a word, but a new language had been born between them in the dark. There was no shame, no regret, only a quiet sense of homecoming that she could not explain. She watched him. The stern lines of his face softened in sleep, and a feeling she had been unable to name for so long finally bloomed in her chest. It was fierce and frightening and undeniable. He woke as if sensing her gaze, his eyes opening to find hers. The morning light was unforgiving, but there were no shadows between them now. Without a word, he reached out and gently took a strand of her long, tangled hair, his fingers deftly beginning to braid it. A simple, intimate gesture that spoke more than words ever could. When he was finished, she reached up and fastened a button on his shirt that had come undone, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his chest. In these small, silent acts of care, a marriage was finally made. The peace, however, was as fragile as a desert flower. A week later, a boy on horseback arrived from town, carrying a telegram. Clara's hands trembled as she tore it open. The words were cold, official, and brutal. A petition had been filed with the county magistrate by several of her neighbors. They were demanding a reevaluation of the Bennett land ownership, citing her illegal and immoral union with a non-citizen savage as proof that she was unfit to hold the title. They wanted her land. A cold dread washed over her. She had been so focused on the daily struggle for survival that she had forgotten the hatred that simmered just beyond their fences. She showed the telegram to Nantan. He read it slowly, his expression hardening into a familiar, impassive mask. But she could see the cold fire in his eyes. "I will go to town," she said, her voice tight. "I will speak to the mayor." He simply nodded. "I will go with you." The ride to town was a silent journey into enemy territory. The stares they received were no longer just curious or contemptuous. They were openly hostile. Men stopped talking to watch them pass, their faces hard with judgment. Women pulled their children away as if they were carriers of a disease. The mayor's office was small and stuffy, filled with the smell of stale cigar smoke. Mayor Thompson was a portly, self-important man with a weak chin and shifty eyes. He listened to Clara's desperate plea with a look of bored impatience. "The law is the law, Mrs. Bennett," he said, using her name with a deliberate, mocking emphasis. "Or whatever you are calling yourself these days. These are good, God-fearing people who filed this petition. They are concerned about the stability of this community." "They are concerned about stealing my land," Clara shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "My father worked that land until the day he died. It is mine." "Your father made a strange choice before he passed," the mayor said, leaning back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "One that has consequences. You made your bed, young lady. Now you must lie in it." Clara felt a surge of white-hot fury. She looked at Nantan, who stood silently behind her, a pillar of stillness in the suffocating room. His presence gave her strength. She turned back to the mayor, her chin high, her eyes blazing. "Then we will lie in it together," she said, her voice ringing with a defiance that stunned the mayor into silence. Their last hope was the circuit judge, a weary, gray-haired man named Peters, who looked as if he carried the weight of the whole territory on his shoulders. He listened patiently, his eyes studying both Clara and Nantan. "The petition has merit under the law, as written," he said tiredly when she had finished. "But so does your deed. I will delay any ruling. For now, but I am warning you. Mrs. Bennett Nantan," he said, his eyes lingering on her husband. "This is a powder keg. If you give these people any excuse, a single misstep, a single complaint, I will have no choice but to rule against you. You will lose it all. Do you understand?" She understood. They were being allowed to exist on borrowed time. The ride home was long and bleak. The small victory felt like a defeat. When they finally reached the farm, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruised purple. The weight of the day, the hatred, the injustice, finally broke her. She slid off the mule and stood in the yard, looking at the small, struggling farm that was her entire world, and began to cry. They were tears of pure, frustrated rage. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She expected to turn and fall into his arms, as she had in the storm. But this time was different. Nantan did not wait for her to reach for him. He gently turned her around and pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tightly. He rested his chin on the top of her head and simply held her as she cried, his strength a silent promise that she was not fighting this battle alone. The judge's warning hung in the air between them, a promise of a precarious future. But in the days that followed, Clara found that the threat did not breed fear. It forged resolve. The silent, awkward dance of their early life together was over. They were no longer two separate people bound by circumstance, but a single unit, a fortress of two against the world. They began to fight back, not with angry words or fists, but with the one thing they had in abundance: work. Their war was not against the town. It was a war against the dust, against the drought, against the idea that they were destined to fail. They woke before the sun, moving with a shared, unspoken purpose. They finished mending the roof that the storm had broken, their hands often brushing as they passed shingles to one another, small touches that spoke volumes. They tackled the well next, a back-breaking task of deepening it by another 10 feet, hauling up buckets of rock and sand until their muscles screamed in protest. But when the water that seeped in was cooler and clearer, when the bucket came up more than half full, they looked at each other, their faces caked in dirt, and a shared look of fierce, exhausted pride passed between them. The corn, planted with Nantan's patient knowledge, began to thrive. The stalks grew taller and greener than any her father had ever managed. Their roots sunk deep into the hidden moisture of the earth. The small patch of land behind the house, which had been barren for years, was cleared and tilled. Clara planted her mother's herbs and the last of their beans and squash, tending to them with a devotion that was both a prayer and a challenge. The farm, which had been a monument to stubborn defeat, slowly began to show signs of life. The land, it seemed, did not care about the color of the hands that tended it. It responded only to care and hard work, and they gave it everything they had. Their life was hard, a relentless cycle of labor from dawn to dusk, but it was a shared hardship that bound them closer than any vows. In the evenings, they would sit at the kitchen table, too tired to speak, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a deep, companionable understanding. He would mend a piece of harness, his fingers deft and sure, while she would patch a shirt, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic motion. The small house, once a place of silent tension, was now a sanctuary, a world of their own making where the hatred of the town could not reach them. And then, a small, unexpected crack of light appeared in the wall of prejudice that surrounded them. It came in the form of a boy, no older than 10, from a neighboring farm. His name was Thomas, a scrawny child with wide, curious eyes. He had seen Nantan from a distance, hunting with his bow, and was captivated. One afternoon, he appeared at the edge of their property, a safe distance away, simply to watch. Nantan, who could sense a field mouse from 50 yards, was well aware of his audience, but he gave no sign. He simply went about his work. The boy returned the next day, and the day after that. Finally, he gathered his courage and approached Nantan, who was carving a piece of wood with his long knife. "What are you making?" Thomas asked, his voice a timid squeak. Nantan did not look up, but he paused his work. "A bird," he said. He continued to carve, and the boy watched, mesmerized, as a small, elegant quail took shape from the formless piece of mesquite. When he was finished, Nantan held it out to the boy. Thomas took it, his eyes wide with wonder. The next day, He returned with his younger sister, and he brought Nantan a small, lumpy loaf of bread his mother had baked. It was a trade, a simple, honest transaction between two people, unburdened by the poison of prejudice. Soon, other children would come, drawn by tales of the quiet Indian who could carve animals from wood and knew the names of all the birds. They were not afraid of him. They saw him not as a savage, but as a man of quiet skill and gentle patience. They would bring him small gifts, a handful of wild berries, a pretty stone from the riverbed, and he would sometimes tell them a story, a short, simple tale of the coyote or the eagle. Clara would watch these exchanges from the porch, a lump forming in her throat. The adults had judged and condemned them, their hearts hardened by fear and ignorance. But the children, with their clear, unclouded eyes, saw only the truth. They saw a good, quiet man. In their innocence, Clara saw a flicker of hope, a suggestion that the world did not have to be the way it was, that the future could be a better, kinder place. But the hatred of the old world was not so easily defeated. It had been festering, and it was about to erupt. It happened on a night so still and quiet you could hear the stars humming. Clara was woken from a deep sleep not by a sound, but by a smell, the acrid, terrifying smell of smoke. She sat bolt upright, her heart instantly pounding with a cold, familiar dread. A hellish orange light was flickering against the bedroom window. "Nantan!" she screamed, scrambling from the bed. He was already moving, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. They burst out of the house into a nightmare. The barn, their small, precious barn where they stored their tools, the last of their seed, and the hay for the mule, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared, a hungry beast devouring the dry wood, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. Judas, the mule, was screaming in terror from his pen nearby. Nantan acted without hesitation, while Clara ran to throw open the gate for Judas, freeing the panicked animal to bolt into the darkness. Nantan grabbed the empty water buckets. It was a hopeless gesture. The fire was too large, the well too far. They could only stand and watch, helpless, as years of work and the fragile structure of their future turned to ash. As the flames began to die down, their terrible work completed, Nantan's eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. He had seen a flicker of movement near the trees. With a low sound, something between a growl and a curse, he began to run, his feet silent on the hard-packed earth, disappearing into the night in pursuit of the ghosts who had done this. "Nantan, no!" Clara cried out after him, but he was gone. She was left alone with the smoldering ruin. The fire cast a demonic glow on the yard, illuminating the scene with a cruel clarity. As the light caught the large barn door, which had fallen from its hinges, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the wood in crude, deep gashes were a handful of words, a message of pure venom. "Go back, half-breed whore." The words were a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. This was not a random act of violence. It was personal. It was a judgment. It was meant to destroy not just their barn, but their very souls. She stood there, shaking, wrapped in a cold that had nothing to do with the night air, and waited for Nantan to return. She waited for an hour, then 2. The ruin of the barn had cooled to a heap of glowing embers. The sky began to pale in the east. There was still no sign of him. A new, more terrible fear began to creep into her heart, a fear that made the loss of the barn seem insignificant. At dawn, she could wait no longer. She began to search, calling his name, her voice thin and desperate in the vast silence of the valley. She followed the direction he had run, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign. She found him half a mile from the farm, lying at the bottom of a shallow, rocky arroyo. For a moment, she thought he was dead. He was lying face down in the dust, unnaturally still. A choked sob escaped her, and she scrambled down the embankment. When she reached him, she saw that he was breathing, his breaths shallow and ragged. She gently turned him over, her hands trembling. His face was a swollen, bruised mask. One eye was swollen shut, and a deep cut ran from his temple to his jaw. His shirt was torn, and his chest and arms were covered in dark, ugly bruises. They had not used knives or guns. There had been more than one of them, and they had used their fists and their boots. They had beaten him and left him for dead. Rage, fierce and protective, surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. She cradled his head in her lap, whispering his name, her tears falling onto the dust on his face. He moaned, a low, animal sound of pain. He was alive. That was all that mattered. Getting him back to the house was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was barely conscious, a dead weight against her. She half dragged, half carried him, her own body screaming in protest, her mind focused on a single, desperate thought. She could not lose him. For 3 days, he hovered in the gray world between life and death. The fever came, and with it, the delirium. Clara did not leave his side. She bathed his wounds, forced sips of water and broth between his cracked lips, and listened as the walls he kept so carefully around his past crumbled into dust. He spoke in his own language, the words guttural and full of a pain she could feel but not understand. But sometimes he spoke in fragmented English, and she became a witness to the ghosts that haunted him. He spoke of his brother, a name repeated over and over again, a name choked with loss. He spoke of blue coats and the long walk, of a time when the world was dust and hunger, when his people had been driven like cattle. He spoke of betrayals, of broken promises, of a life that had been stolen from him piece by piece until all that was left was a silence as vast as the desert. Clara listened, her heart aching. She was not just nursing a broken body, she was tending to a broken spirit. She was seeing the man behind the mask, the man whose deep well of silence was filled with a grief she could barely comprehend. And as she listened, her love for him, which had grown so quietly in the shared work of their days, now deepened into something fierce, absolute, and unbreakable. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at her, his gaze steady. Though his body was weak, he tried to sit up, but winced in pain.
"Lie still,"
she whispered, her hand gently pressing on his uninjured shoulder. He looked around the room, his memory slowly returning. He looked at his own bruised hands, then back at her face. He had failed. He had not caught them. He had let them do this to him. To them. A shadow of defeat crossed his face. Clara could not bear it. She needed him to know. She knelt beside the bed, taking his hand in hers, her touch gentle.
"Nantan,"
she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When my father gave me to you, I hated him. I hated you. I never wanted to marry you." She paused, taking a shaky breath, forcing herself to say the words that were truest in her heart. "But now I cannot imagine a life without you. Do you hear me? I cannot—" He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, seeing the raw, unvarnished truth of her words. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound in the room their shared breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough whisper, but his words were a vow stronger than any spoken before a preacher. "You chose me," he said, his fingers tightening slightly around hers. "When they hated you, I will stay." A week later, Nantan was on his feet, his body still healing, but his spirit mended by her words. The ruin of the barn was a constant, ugly reminder of their vulnerability. They had nothing. The tools were gone. The seed was gone. There was no money to rebuild. That afternoon, Clara went to the small wooden chest where her mother's things were kept. She took out a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a delicate gold locket and her mother's simple, thin gold wedding band. They were the last remnants of her past, the only things of value she owned. The next morning, they rode into town. The whispers and stares followed them as always, but this time they were tinged with a smug, satisfied cruelty. Everyone knew about the fire. Everyone approved. Clara ignored them. She walked into the general store, her head held high, Nantan a half-step behind her. She did not go to the assayer, who would cheat her. She went directly to Mr. Gable, the store owner, a man who, for all his wife's prejudice, was known to be honest in business. She sold her mother's jewelry for a fraction of its worth, enough to buy lumber, nails, and new tools. As they left the store, Clara did something she had never done before. As they stepped out onto the dusty street, in full view of the entire town, she reached out and took Nantan's hand, lacing her fingers through his. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her, a look of surprise in his eyes. She met his gaze, her chin held high, a silent declaration to the world. Let them stare, let them hate. We are together. Their final stop was the judge's office. They did not come with pleas this time. They came with proof. Clara laid out the deed to the land and the receipts for the taxes they had paid, every last one. They were citizens. They were landowners. They met their obligations. Then she placed one last thing on his desk. It was a piece of butcher paper, signed with the crude, childish scrawls of a dozen names. At the top, in Thomas's neatest printing, it said, "They are good." Beside some of the names were small drawings, a bird, a flower, a smiling sun. Judge Peters looked at the land records. He looked at the tax receipts. Then he picked up the children's petition. He stared at it for a long time, a flicker of some unreadable emotion in his weary eyes. He looked up at Clara, then at Nantan, who stood behind her, his battered face a stoic mask. The judge let out a long, slow sigh. There are laws of the land, and there are laws of decency, he muttered, more to himself than to them. He looked down at the petition again. You two have proven you have more character than half this county. He picked up his stamp and brought it down on the petition against them. Stay of ruling granted, he said, his voice firm. Indefinitely. The judge's ruling was not a victory, but a ceasefire. It did not change the hearts of the men who hated them, but it gave them something more valuable than acceptance. It gave them time, and time, on the land, was a form of magic. The months that followed were a quiet testament to their truce with the world. Autumn bled into a mild, damp winter, and winter gave way to a spring that bloomed with a tentative, hard-won hope. They rebuilt the barn, their movements a synchronized ballet of shared labor. The sound of Clara's hammer striking nails was a steady, defiant rhythm against the valley's silence, a counterpoint to the quiet rasp of Nantan's saw. The new structure rose from the ashes of the old, stronger and more carefully built, a symbol of their refusal to be broken. The scar on the earth healed, and so did the scars on their bodies and their spirits. The land, as if rewarding their resilience, began to flourish. The well, now deep and true, ran clean and cold. The corn grew in thick, emerald rows, their tassels catching the summer breeze like golden threads. The squash vines snaked across the tilled earth, their broad leaves offering shade to the swelling, striped fruit beneath. The farm, which had for so long been a place of lack, of dust and despair, became a place of abundance. They ate well, their table laden with the fruits of their shared toil. There was a quiet satisfaction in the weight of a harvested melon, in the earthy smell of a freshly dug potato, that went deeper than words. It was the feeling of life itself, coaxed from a land that had for so long offered only death. In the quiet of the evenings, after the work was done, Clara found a new voice. She took one of her father's empty ledgers, its pages clean and waiting, and began to write. At first, her words were hesitant, simple records of the weather, of the crops, of the price of flour in town. But as the pages filled, something else began to emerge. She wrote of Nantan, of the quiet strength in his hands, of the rare smiles that transformed his face. She wrote of her own transformation, from a girl filled with shame and anger to a woman who had found a home in the most unlikely of places. Her voice on the page was clear and strong, a voice she had not known she possessed. One night, by the soft light of the lamp, she wrote a line that seemed to come not from her own mind, but from the heart of the land itself. The world will not remember Jacob Bennett's daughter or the Apache warrior who became her husband, she wrote, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room. They will forget our names, buried as they will be by the dust of years. But perhaps the land will remember. Perhaps they will not forget our story. While she was building a legacy of words, Nantan was creating one of stone and wood. In a small, sheltered clearing at the edge of the woods that bordered the river, he began to build a shrine. It was not a large or elaborate thing. He gathered smooth, flat stones from the riverbed and stacked them with a careful, patient reverence. At the top, he placed a piece of weathered wood, carved with symbols she did not understand but whose sacredness she could feel. It was a place for his ancestors, a way of anchoring his own history, his own ghosts, to this new land that was now his. He never invited her there, but he did not forbid her from going. Sometimes, in the early morning, Clara would walk to the clearing and leave a small offering at the base of the stones, a spray of wildflowers, a perfect, red-streaked feather from a hawk. It was her own silent way of honoring his world, of acknowledging the spirits that had shaped the man she loved. It was a gesture of peace, a weaving together of their two separate pasts into a single, shared present. They had found a fragile peace, a small island of existence in a hostile sea. But the sea was never truly calm. The hatred of the town had not vanished. It had simply gone quiet, biding its time, waiting for an opportunity. The final threat, when it came, arrived with the sudden, terrifying violence of a flash flood. It was a moonless night late in the summer, the air thick and heavy with the coming of autumn. A strange stillness had fallen over the land, a silence that felt heavy, watchful. They had gone to bed early, tired from a long day of harvesting. Clara was woken by a sound that cut through her sleep, a sound that she would forever associate with terror, the sound of many horses, moving not with the steady gait of travelers, but with the angry, agitated stomp of a mob. She was out of bed in an instant, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Nantan was already at the window, a dark silhouette against the faint starlight. He did not need to say a word. She could see them. A group of perhaps a dozen riders was approaching the house, their forms made monstrous by the flickering, hellish light of the torches they carried. Guns, torches, hate. The world had come to burn them out. "The rifle," Nantan said, his voice a low, calm rumble that did not betray the slightest hint of fear. Clara moved without thinking, her body acting on pure, primal instinct. She took her father's old army rifle from its pegs on the wall. The metal was cold and heavy in her hands, a solid, deadly reality. She checked the load, her fingers moving with a sureness she had not known they possessed. This was not the frightened girl who had hidden behind a barred door. This was a woman defending her home. She walked to the front door and threw it open. Stepping out onto the porch, she did not raise the rifle to her shoulder, but held it firmly across her body. A clear and unambiguous statement. Nantan stepped out beside her, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. He stood tall and straight, his presence as solid and as immovable as the mountains behind them. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their message was in their stance, in their stillness. They would not fire, but they would not run. The riders reined in their horses 20 yards from the porch, forming a ragged, menacing semicircle. In the flickering torchlight, Clara could see their faces. It was Jebediah and his friends. But there were others, older men from town, their faces twisted into masks of self-righteous fury. They were a vigilante group, a mob who had appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner.
"This is your last chance, squaw man,"
Jebediah shouted, his voice slurring slightly with whiskey.
"Take your whore and get off this land before we burn you both out like the rats you are."
Clara's knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. The insult washed over her, but it had no power to wound her anymore. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at their weak, hate-filled eyes, and she felt not fear but a profound and weary pity. Nantan did not answer. He simply watched them, his gaze moving from one man to the next, his stillness a silent accusation that was more powerful than any shouted threat. The standoff stretched, the air thick with the smell of pine pitch from the torches and the raw, metallic scent of impending violence. The mob grew restless, their courage fueled by whiskey and their shared hatred, but also unnerved by the couple's silent defiance. This was not the cowering they had expected.
"To hell with this,"
one of the men yelled, raising his pistol.
"Let's just end it."
A shot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered the night stillness. Clara flinched, her body tensing for the impact of the bullet. But she was not hit. Instead, one of the riders beside Jebediah gave a choked cry of surprise and pain, clutching at his shoulder as he slumped sideways and fell from his horse. For a heartbeat, there was a stunned, absolute silence. The mob looked at the fallen man, then at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. Who had fired? It had not been the Indian. It had not been the woman. The shot had come from the darkness to their right, from the direction of the old county road. A voice, rough and familiar, cut through the confusion.
"You get the hell off this land, now!"
A figure emerged from the shadows, holding a smoking rifle. It was Mr. Henderson, their neighbor, a hard, quiet man who had lost his barn on that first terrible night. He had never spoken a word to them, had never offered a gesture of friendship or condemnation, but he had watched. He had seen them rebuild. He had seen Nantan's quiet dignity, Clara's fierce resolve. He had seen the children who flocked to their farm, and in the dark of this night, he had made a choice. The vigilantes stared at Henderson as if he had grown a second head. The sight of one of their own standing against them, defending the very people they had come to destroy, shattered their mob courage. It was one thing to be a part of a righteous crowd. It was another to be in a gunfight where the lines were no longer so clearly drawn. Jebediah cursed, yanking his horse's head around. He kicked his heels into its flanks and galloped away into the darkness. The others, their courage evaporating like mist, followed suit, scattering in a panicked, disorderly retreat, their brave crusade dissolving into a cowardly rout. Dawn came, soft and gray, on a world that felt newborn. The farm stood. The air was clean, washed of the stench of hate and torch smoke. Mr. Henderson had vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the knowledge that they were not entirely alone. Clara and Nantan sat on the top step of the porch, the rifle resting on the boards beside them. The exhaustion was bone deep, a weariness that went beyond the physical. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt a familiar comfort. "You protected my farm," she whispered, the words an echo from a lifetime ago. She turned her head to look up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "And tonight, I protected our home." He looked down at her, and a smile touched his lips, a rare, quiet thing that was more beautiful than any sunrise. It was a smile of pride, of love, of a victory won not with bullets, but with stubborn, unyielding stillness.
"We are not theirs to burn,"
he said, his voice a low, firm promise. The final scene of their story was not written in a ledger, but on the land itself, several seasons later. The sun, a benevolent gold, streamed down on fields that were no longer just surviving, but thriving. The corn was tall and heavy with ears, and the squash vines were a riot of green and yellow. Clara, her body full and round with the new life she carried inside her, walked slowly through the sunlit rows. She paused to rest a hand on her swelling belly, a secret, contented smile on her face, from his place mending a fence line. Nantan watched her. He saw the way the light caught in her hair, the way she moved with a new, deliberate grace. He walked over to the edge of the field, the rich, dark earth cool beneath his bare feet. He leaned against the fence post, still watching his wife, and rested his other hand on the top of the post, on the warm, sun-baked wood that was a part of the growing, fertile belly of the earth. The land does not forget. It holds the memory of every hardship, every fire, every tear that has watered its soil. But in the quiet, sun-drenched space between two people who had refused to be broken, love, stubborn and resilient, grows anyway. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect, and please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.